We are delighted to have all of you with us today. We appreciate the fact that you're here and that you're interested in the study of the Bible. We have some visitors today. We're delighted to have Brother and Sister Milton Sewell with us today. He is the brother to Sister Solomon. They're here to help them celebrate their 65th wedding anniversary. I first met Brother Sewell when I was preaching in Atlanta and have known of his work through the years since then. He became the president of Freed-Hardeman University and did a tremendous job during his reign. I was never concerned about the direction in which Freed-Hardeman would go as long as Brother Sewell was the president. And I'm not to this point. I believe in the direction in which it is going. Brother Sewell helped point it in the right direction. We appreciate the fact that he served in that position, and we're delighted to have him and his good wife here today, as well as all of you. Last week and this week, we have been studying and are studying Bible wines and social drinking. Now, this is not the most pleasant study for me. I'd rather preach on some other things than this. But if there's a possibility that someone may not know what the Bible teaches and may engage in it and lose his soul, then I would feel that I was responsible in part for it if I didn't teach on it. I appreciate the fact that our elders want our people to know the truth on this subject. I am grateful to them for the opportunity. Appreciate the fact that Scott gave up a couple of Sundays in his class in order to do this. I've been laying a foundation by studying about Bible wines. By the way, I have a weak throat today, and if it gives out, Terry has volunteered to take over. And Scott has too. So if I give out, they'll take over. We've been talking about Bible wines, and the fact that the word wine in the Bible can carry two meanings. It's a generic word, and you can't tell by the word wine which one it's talking about. The context and the general teaching of the Bible tells us which one it's talking about. It is a word that means sometimes alcoholic wine, sometimes it just means pure grape juice. And if we do not understand that, we will not understand what the Bible teaches about this subject. So we've tried to emphasize that fact. We've talked about some of the myths that people hold that help them to misunderstand the Bible. And last week, as we closed, we were talking about some scriptures that those who are social drinkers use to try to justify it. Now, I don't believe the average member of the church who is a social drinker uses all those verses trying to defend it. But there are some who do, and therefore it was necessary for us to spend some time talking about them. We came to the last one that I wanted to mention, and it is in regard to the Lord's Supper. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul gave some teaching about the Lord's Supper, beginning with verse 20. When you come together, therefore, into one place, this is not to eat the Lord's Supper. That sounds contradictory, doesn't it? They should have been coming together to eat the Lord's Supper, but they were not. They had substituted a regular meal for the Lord's Supper. And so he said in the next verse, for in eating, everyone taketh before his own supper. They brought their meal together. They were eating it in their worship rather than observing the Lord's Supper properly. So he said, for in eating, everyone taketh before his own supper, and one is hungry and another is drunken. And I believe that last expression is a mistranslation. Now, I'm not the Greek scholar that David and Scott are, but I'm telling you what I have found in it. I believe that they have given what their opinion is and their background, their thinking, that the Lord's Supper had alcoholic wine in it. And so they translated it. One is hungry and another is drunken. Now, I don't believe the word drunken is the best translation in that passage. Now, in that particular section, there is a difference. Now, you will read in most translations that it uses the word drunken. Now, Greek lexicons tell us that the word translated drunken there can also mean to be filled, to have enough. As I sometimes say after I eat, I have dined sufficiently. And the word can mean they've had enough. I don't believe that the word drunken is implied in the context there, though most translations translate it as drunken. Alexander Campbell was a great Bible scholar, and he translated the New Testament from Greek into English. And let me tell you what his translation was on that particular word. In regard to that particular passage, he said, one indeed is hungry and another is filled. That's Alexander Campbell's translation. And that fits the context. To say one is drunken doesn't fit the context. Paul gives this illustration. They brought their own food together. They were eating. One was hungry and another is filled. That's the contrast. It's like, according to this verse, it's like comparing apples and oranges. But here he gives this idea. One is hungry, another is filled, because they were eating the regular meal. Some of them didn't bring their food. For some reason they didn't have anything to eat. They were hungry. Then others who brought their food were filled. The context, so far as I can tell, does not suggest that they were drunk. I believe Brother Alexander Campbell's translation is the correct one. When you study the whole Bible on this subject, as we're trying to do, I believe that it is a mistranslation. Sometimes the translators, especially in the King James, mistranslated words. For example, in Acts 12:4, when it uses the word Easter. Well, Easter wasn't known at that time. The word that's used there is Passover. So sometimes when they use another word rather than the correct word, it leaves the wrong idea. Now, some people believe that they had alcoholic wine in the Lord's Supper, and I believe that is a mistake. Now, some people will tell you, well, they used alcoholic wine in the Lord's Supper, and that probably is why this idea was given in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 21. Some people believe for a long time that they used alcoholic wine in the Lord's Supper. But let me make this statement, and please hit the save button on the computer of your mind. Remember this. The word wine is never used in the Bible in reference to the drink in the Lord's Supper. The word wine is never used to describe that drink. It is cup or fruit of the vine. Now, calling it wine leaves the wrong impression with people. I believe that's one of the mistakes in 1 Corinthians 11:21. When they called it wine, it leaves the impression with people today that it was alcoholic. If you go outside this building, as I said last week, and you took a survey and asked people what is wine, about 99 times out of 4, they will say it's alcohol. But that's not the meaning of it in the Bible. And when people do not understand that difference, they will not understand what the Bible teaches. The context and the general teaching of the Bible should tell us which one is meant. Calling it wine here, I believe, leaves the wrong impression with people. When people teach that we'll be using alcoholic wine in the Lord's Supper, leaves the wrong impression with people that we drink wine. When I was a young preacher, I found out that there were congregations that used alcoholic wine in the Lord's Supper. Perhaps you've run across that now and then. I have. But I believe it is not scriptural. I don't believe it can be sustained in Scripture. Now, I learned somewhere along the line from Johnny Ramsey the truth on this matter. Johnny Ramsey was a great Bible scholar and preacher. I think Scott would tell you, after he was baptized, Johnny Ramsey was one of his first mentors, if not the first. He was a great Bible scholar. And he taught me some things that I didn't know. Go back to the 12th chapter of Exodus, and you will read where the Passover feast was instituted. Read it carefully. I've done that. I've done it in the past, and here recently, as I've studied for this lesson, I read it, and I read it again. There are two things you will observe. Number one, a drink in the Passover feast is not mentioned there. Number two, there's a scripture that teaches in that passage that it could not be alcoholic wine in the Passover feast. There is a passage in that text about the Passover feast which tells us that they could not use alcoholic wine in the Lord's Supper, as Jesus did later, at that time in the Passover feast, because it teaches they were not to have leaven or yeast in the house 7 days after Passover. They could not use it in the Passover feast, and they could not have it for 7 days afterwards. They couldn't have leaven. Now, leaven is in the alcoholic drink. Yeast is in the alcoholic drink. They would have violated that passage if they had had alcohol and had it in the Passover feast. So when Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper, he used the emblems that were used in the Passover. Many people say it was alcohol. If it was alcohol, would Jesus not have violated that law? If they couldn't have leaven in the house, wouldn't he have violated that law in instituting of the Lord's Supper? I believe that he would have. I don't believe he did. I don't believe they used alcoholic wine in the institution of the Lord's Supper, and it could not have been used in the Passover feast. Now give some thought to that. Go back and read Exodus chapter 12 again and see if that's not true. Now, that's why we use unleavened bread in the Lord's Supper. Why is that? Because that's what they were taught in the law for the Passover feast, unleavened bread. And the passage that teaches they could not have leaven in the house, even for 7 days after Passover, shows that surely Jesus did not use alcoholic wine in the Lord's Supper. Now, I throw that out for you to consider, study it carefully, and see if that's not what the Bible teaches. Now, some people say the Bible condemns drunkenness, but not moderate drinking. I believe that's a misunderstanding of the word drunkenness. What is drunkenness? It is being influenced by alcohol, taking influence within your body, being influenced by it. Now, when is one drunk? When does God consider one drunk? When he takes that alcohol into his body as a drink, that first drink affects him. Medical science shows us that is the case. That first drink affects one, and it affects one's thinking, his judgment, and his ability to make decisions, you see, and do the right thing. And if he takes that drink into his body, it affects his mind, and he may have the wrong judgment. He may not have the ability to distinguish between right and wrong, and you know that is true. Now, when does God consider him drunk? When he takes that first drink and it affects his mind, his judgment, and the ability to distinguish between right and wrong. Now, drive a peg down right there in that, and we want to come back to it later. But we want to emphasize the fact that some people misunderstand what drunkenness is. They think drunkenness is when you're so drunk you can't walk straight, or when you pass out and die. That's drunkenness. But also when a person takes enough that it affects his body, 0.05%, 5/100th of 1%. And when he doesn't drink that much, he takes that first drink, and the least amount that can be measured by medical science is 0.005, 5/1000th of 1%. That's very little. When he takes that first drink, medical science says it affects him. It affects his thinking, his judgment. So we need to think of those things when we try to determine if drinking alcohol is all right, if it's just a little bit. Let me mention something else, a statement or two from medical science. Now, this comes from the Journal of American Medical Association. This is not what some preacher said. This is from the American Medical Association, talking about blood alcohol concentration, BAC. Although legal limits for BAC levels have been set in most states, impairment in driving skills can occur with any amount of alcohol in the bloodstream. When you take any amount, you drink one drink, you say, I'm just being moderate, but that one drink can affect you. That's what medical science says. Then let me quote from a medical doctor, a brain surgeon, Dr. Richard Strain. He said, as a brain surgeon, I have yet to meet a moderate drinking colleague who would like to have me operate on his son after I have had a few. His colleagues, in some cases, were moderate drinkers, but he is saying he doesn't know one that would want him to operate on his son for brain surgery after he's had a drink. That's pretty powerful, isn't it? He said, no person does his best after drinking. He may think he does, but his judgment is defective. Moderation is a terrible fallacy. And even those doctors that are moderate drinkers would agree with that. They would not want that brain surgeon operating on their son's brain after he's had a drink. So those are some things that we need to look at outside the Bible, but in the medical profession. Now, I have tried to show in the previous lesson that many people misunderstand what the Bible teaches because they do not understand that the word wine in the Bible sometimes refers to alcohol, sometimes just pure grape juice. We read a number of scriptures last week, just reminding you of that fact. Isaiah 65, verse 8 is one. Isaiah 16 and verse 10. Both show that juice, pure juice of the grape, is called wine. And then there are passages in which the word wine refers to alcohol. Now, I do not always know who may be a social drinker. I'll just confess, I don't know anybody in this congregation that's a social drinker. In places where I have preached regularly, I was there for years and years, and there were some that I didn't know were social drinkers. I received a call one night about 10 o'clock from a lady in the congregation. She and her husband and teenage daughter were members of that congregation. She said, I just got my husband out of jail. He was arrested for drunk driving. I didn't know he was drinking. I'd known him for years. They were friends, but I didn't know it. He wanted to talk to me. So I went over and talked with him and found that he had been an alcoholic before becoming a Christian, but he obeyed the gospel, gave up drinking, and for 17 years he had not been drinking. But recently he had been tempted by some of his fellow workers, and he took a drink, and he was gone again, drunk again. Now, I didn't know that he had been drinking. I don't always know. We just need to teach the truth on this subject and try to prevent somebody from becoming a drunkard or being influenced at all by alcohol. My primary concern in this series of lessons is that some Christians may drink and be influenced by this to such an extent that it affects them. Well, I don't know how to cause every drunk to give up the bottle. And by using the word drunk, I don't mean to be offensive at all or unkind. That's just the word the Bible uses. Now, we use alcoholic today. That's somewhat of a euphemism, a softened term for the real thing. But one is drunk. Now, I don't know how to help everyone to give up the bottle. I don't know of any preacher who has been very successful in helping everyone who drinks to give up the bottle. But perhaps my greatest contribution will be in prevention. If I can teach what the Bible teaches and discourage anyone from ever taking that first drink, maybe I've helped somewhat in that regard. But it is a very difficult thing to persuade a drunk to give up the bottle. What is social drinking then? That's what we're concerned about today primarily. What is social drinking? Well, let me point out some things that are wrong with it. Social drinking is wrong because of its consequences. I don't need to remind you of all the terrible things that come from drinking. I can tell you a number of them, but just one is enough. Half of the people who are killed in automobile accidents are killed because of drinking. There are a number of tragic consequences that come from drinking. Alcohol is a deadly drug, and it ranks as the third most serious health problem behind heart trouble and cancer. Drinking is the number 3 health problem today. It is estimated that 1 in 9 people who are social drinkers will become a drunkard. 1 in 9. That's like playing Russian roulette. You know what Russian roulette is. You take a pistol that has a revolving magazine in it, and it holds 9 bullets. Suppose you put 1 bullet in one of those holes, spin that cylinder, and then put the gun to your head and pull the trigger. You have 1 in 9 chances that you're going to die. You say, that doesn't make sense. It doesn't. But if you drink socially, there's 1 in 9 chances that you're going to become a drunkard or an alcoholic. Does that make sense? Doesn't make sense at all, does it? There's no test that you can take beforehand to determine if you're going to be that one out of 9. You can't take a test and determine that. The only way you'll know it is drink and then get hooked on it. Alcohol destroys the body. In 1 Corinthians 6, 19 and 20, you remember that Paul said, what? Know you not that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit, which is in you, which you have of God, and you're not your own. Therefore glorify God in your body, in your spirit, and in your body. We understand that in regard to heroin, marijuana, some of these other drugs. We understand that you ought not to do that as a Christian because it can destroy your body. Somehow, some members of the church don't understand that in regard to drinking. Drinking probably causes more deaths than heroin, marijuana, and some of these other drugs. Many people die from drinking alcohol, and so it destroys the body. Alcohol is a depressant drug, and it has its first influence upon a person's central nervous system. When he drinks it, it affects the central nervous system. It first affects the part of the brain which controls restraint and judgment. When you drink at all, it controls your judgment and restraint. Those who drink sometimes will do something they wouldn't do ordinarily. Why is that? Because alcohol takes away his ability to restrain himself, takes away his ability to make judgment. Alcohol is a depressant drug, and it has its effect, first of all, upon the central nervous system. Then it affects one's physical condition. First, you take a drink, and it affects your judgment, your restraint. You drink a little more, and it affects your body. You can't walk straight. You have slurred speech. It affects you physically in various ways. Dr. Max Heyman, psychiatrist of the Alcoholism Research Center at UCLA, said, as for health, it is common knowledge that chronic alcoholism is associated with a high mortality rate. If people are alcoholics, they're going to die early. There's a higher mortality rate. But listen to what he said. What is less well known is the recent evidence that social drinking also shortens life considerably. Now, that's not what this preacher said, or Scott or David, Brother Sewell. All of us who've done a lot of teaching and preaching don't believe it's right. But this is not what a preacher said. This is what Dr. Max Heyman, psychiatrist at the Alcoholism Research Center. Social drinking can affect your lifespan considerably. Social drinking will increase your chances of developing cirrhosis of the liver by 7 times. Now, cirrhosis of the liver can kill you. And if you drink socially, medical science says it increases your possibility of contracting cirrhosis of the liver by 7 times. That's how dangerous it is. Well, now there are some folks who say, but that's talking about hard liquor. When people drink hard liquors, that's what it will do. Well, the fact is that beer and lighter liquids also have the same effect. It's the alcohol in it that does it. There are a lot of beer alcoholics, a lot of folks who are drunkards on beer. They haven't drunk those heavier liquors. So just any kind of alcohol, beer or heavier, can also bring that result. It can result in death, serious illness. Social drinking also destroys the mind. Dr. Melvin Nisley, who was the head of the anatomy department in the medical school in South Carolina, had a news conference in Washington. He said to these people in the news conference that so-called social drinking results in a great deal of brain damage. Think about that. Just social drinking can result in a great deal of brain damage. He stated that as many as 10,000 brain cells are destroyed at one time with one drink. Social drinker can take one drink and he can destroy 10,000 brain cells. Now, you have a lot of brain cells, so you say, well, I can afford to lose some. I can't. But take one drink and you can destroy 10,000 brain cells. And he says the damage is cumulative. It adds up. 10,000 this time, 10,000 the next time, 10,000 the next time. Pretty soon, you know, you've destroyed a lot of your brain. He said that Skid Row drunks cannot be used as cadavers to teach medical students normal brain structure. You know, in almost all big cities, they have an area they may call Skid Row. That's where the drunkards go, lie around vomiting over themselves, sleeping and dying. And oftentimes, they don't have any identification on them. And when one of them dies, the authorities don't know who to contact. And they donate those bodies of the drunks to medical schools to be cadavers. They can cut them up and learn something about the structure of the body. But he says they cannot be used as cadavers to teach normal brain structure because their brains have been destroyed by alcohol. That's what it will do. It destroys the brain. And oftentimes when people do that, senility sets in. When people drink, destroys the brain, they become senile. And they do things and say things that are comical, really. In Hosea 4, verse 11, and I know Brother Turner doesn't pronounce it that way, but Hosea 4:11, whoredom and wine and new wine take away the heart. Now, read some other translations on that. That expression, take away the heart, is translated in one translation, loses his common sense. That's what it does. Loses his common sense, takes away the heart. So you see, alcohol, just social drinking, harms you just as being an alcoholic, one who passes out from drinking. It is a very dangerous thing. Social drinking then destroys the mind as well as the body. Social drinking enslaves the person. And the Christian must be enslaved only by Christ. He must be given to Christ all the way. Doesn't Paul say, let not therefore sin reign in your mortal body? You don't let sin control you. Alcohol is one of those things that can do it. You let Christ control you. In Galatians 2:20, Paul said, I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live. Yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. And the life that I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. Paul was Christ devoted, Christ dominated, Christ regulated. He had given himself to Christ all the way, and he was governed by Christ. He didn't let sin reign in his mortal body. But alcohol can do that. And if you begin to drink, you're not the master anymore. Drink is the master. I've seen it. I've worked with it all of my life. My dad was a drunkard. I know what it will do. We're not to allow sin to reign in us. But if you start drinking, even though you don't drink a great deal, you'll find it very hard to give it up. You don't believe that? If you drink, try giving it up. You'll find that alcohol reigns in your body. Well, men under the influence of alcohol will do things they wouldn't ordinarily do. You listen to some of these programs on TV that tell about murders and crimes committed, and when a person is arrested for it, oftentimes his defense is, well, I was drunk. I didn't know what I was doing. That's true. It often happens that way. I have in my files a story of a teenage girl who was having a problem. Her mother took her to the doctor. The doctor ran some tests, and he said, your problem is you're expecting a baby. She could not believe it. She denied ever engaging in immorality. She could not believe she was expecting a baby. But upon further examination, they found that she was in a group of teenagers, and there was a great deal of drinking, and a boy kept giving her alcohol, getting her to drink more and more. Then after a while, she lost her judgment and her restraint and must have engaged in immorality with him, didn't even remember it later. That's what alcohol can do. You can lose your restraint, you can lose your judgment, and therefore you can do things that you wouldn't ordinarily do. Did you know that airlines would not allow their pilots to fly if they've had one drink in the last 24 hours? I'm glad they have that. I don't want to fly with a pilot who's been drinking. In recent months, I have read 2 stories in the news about pilots who came to fly a passenger plane and were found to have had a drink within 24 hours, and they were arrested. They can be arrested for that because the airlines know how dangerous it is. If a pilot has had one drink, it can affect his judgment, his restraint. He can be dangerous flying a plane with 400 people on it. I also have in my files the story of a San Diego beer firm. They delivered beer to various stores. But that beer firm will not allow their drivers or their trucks to have one beer during the day they're driving. Why is that? Because the beer firms know their product. They know what it will do. One of the drivers could drink one beer, and it can affect his judgment. And if he has a wreck and kills somebody, his company can be sued for millions of dollars. They know their product. They know what it will do. So it is not the amount of alcohol that really determines alcoholism. It's alcohol. It's alcohol. And you can take one drink, and it can affect your judgment. So social drinking is tragic because it affects physically, mentally, and it can become the master in your life. Social drinking is wrong because it destroys Christian influence. Now, we often hear this passage in Matthew 5 and verse 16 where Jesus said that we ought to have a good influence upon others. Good influence. Let your life be such that people will see you and glorify God, your Heavenly Father. We're not to do something that will hurt our influence or cause other people to look down upon us. Romans 14:21 teaches the same thing. Now, suppose I were drinking. Suppose you saw me drinking a beer or maybe one of the stronger alcohols, wine or whatever. What would you think of me? Would you listen to me preach anymore? You wouldn't have any confidence in me, and rightly so. I have as much right to drink as any of you. You know that? If you have a right to drink socially, so do I. The Bible does not give us one moral standard for the preacher and another one for everybody else. And so it hurts our influence if we drink. Think about that. If you're not a preacher, elder, or deacon, and you drink, other people know it, it can hurt your influence as well. There was a man who was not a Christian. His wife was a Christian, but he had never obeyed the gospel. He had put it off a long time, and he had some men friends in the church. Somebody asked his wife, "Why do you suppose your husband has never obeyed the gospel?" She said, "It may be because he is invited to church by some of the same men who ask him to have a drink with them." You see, if a man is drinking alcohol and he invites a person who's not a Christian to have a drink with him, he won't be able to influence them to become a Christian. It hurts our influence if we drink. Now, we must sacrifice sometimes even things that may be right within themselves if those things will cause other people to stumble. You read that in 1 Corinthians 10, verses 30 through 33. Give none offense, neither to the Jews, nor to the Gentiles, nor to the church of God. And in the context, he's talking somewhat about eating meats offered to idols. Now, normally it's not wrong for a person to eat meat that has been offered to idols if he doesn't worship idols and that type of thing. But if in doing it, he causes somebody else to stumble, he ought to be willing to give it up. If you drink, you will cause others, especially young people, to stumble and begin drinking. We have some fine young people here. I love these young people just as I love all the older people. And I would not want our young people to see any member of the church drinking, being a social drinker, because it can encourage them to drink, thinking it's all right. Now, let me make a statement here. It may cause you to bite a hole in your chewing gum, but I want you to think about it carefully. The social drinker does more harm to the cause of Christ than the Skid Row drunk. Now, that may hurt, but if you think about it, you'll see it's true. You've heard about these Skid Row drunks in these large cities where the people just lie around drunk all the time, dying, lost their husband or wife, as the case may be, lost their job, lost everything that means anything in life to them. When the alcohol industry wants to encourage young people to drink, do they give you that picture? Do they tell you about those drunks and show you how they're living? No, no, no. They show you the person who's dressed well, who doesn't vomit all over himself, who hasn't been fired because he's drinking, who hasn't been fired from positions he may have held because of drinking. He dresses well. The alcohol industry pictures him as a good-looking man, well-dressed, clean-shaven, sitting in a beautiful convertible automobile with a beautiful woman beside him, and they've got a glass of champagne in their hands. That's what they picture to you. Young people see that and they say, boy, that's the way to live. I'd like to be like them. It is those who are social drinkers who encourage young people to drink, not those drunks. If they see those drunks and what's happened to them, they won't say, well, I'd like to drink too. I'd like to become like them. It doesn't work that way. Social drinkers do more harm to the cause of Christ than Skid Row drunks. And then finally, social drinking is wrong because the Scriptures condemn it. Last week, we went over a number of Scriptures in the Old Testament as well as the New that teaches that God hates alcohol. Time after time, God teaches that he hates alcohol. But there, obviously, he's talking about alcoholic drinks that people drink. He's not talking about grape juice. He's not talking about grape juice that's called wine. He's talking about alcoholic drinks. Proverbs 20 and verse 1, wine is a mocker, strong drink is raging, and whosoever is deceived thereby are not wise. It is not wise to drink that alcohol. Solomon did not say drinking to excess is raging. He says wine is a mocker, strong drink is raging. It mocks him. How does strong drink mock you? It tries to tell you how it's going to bless you, how you're going to live the high life. You'll be the life of the party. You ought to drink. That's not what Solomon said. Strong drink is raging. I want to tell you a story. I want you to listen carefully to this because it tells what can happen to you. Some years ago, our brethren decided it would be good to put out some sermon books by the various great preachers. And so they had those preachers prepare sermons and then put them in a book. A number of them were placed in books. One series was called 20th Century Christians Sermons. Right in the middle, in the top line of preachers is V.P. Black. V.P. Black was one of the greatest preachers we've ever known. He's the most powerful preacher I have ever heard personally. Great man, good man. It's good to have sermons by men like that. So they have a number of men whose sermons were recorded. There's another series called the Great Preachers of Today series. A number of preachers were in this series. Jim Bill McIntyre, Willard Collins, some of the great preachers. Here's a book by one of those preachers. He no doubt was a good man. He was a great gospel preacher. He's in the Great Preachers of Today series. He became the administrator, the president of George Pepperdine University, just as Brother Sewell was the president of Freed-Hardeman College. Along the way, this man began to drink socially. On one occasion, there was a woman, about 51 years of age, who was driving her compact car. In the car was her mother, who was 78, I believe, and then her mother's friend, another elderly woman. And they came to a traffic light. It was red, and she stopped there for the traffic light. But there was a car coming along behind her, a big, nice automobile, but they didn't even slow down. It ran into the back of her car. The gas tank exploded. 2 of those women died. That man was arrested for drunk driving. This man, gospel preacher, president of Freed-Hardeman, not Freed-Hardeman, Pepperdine. You think I'm on? I got my tongue up. Pepperdine University, president of it. He explained it by saying it's a very difficult job. A lot of effort goes into it, hard to do. Brother Sewell can tell you that about Freed-Hardeman College. It is difficult being a president. A lot of responsibility. It's difficult. This man said he began to drink to try to help that problem, calm his nerves and all that work. I'm sure he was a good man. When he was placed in this book, Great Preachers of Today, I'm sure he was a good man. I doubt that he intended to go that far, but he thought he could drink a little bit, calm his nerves, and it would help him. But this is what he became. He became a drunkard, killed those 2 people, and was arrested for vehicular homicide. That's why we don't need to drink. It can help us in the wrong way. Put us to sleep, all right. Might make you feel better, but it can destroy you. Well, in Proverbs 23, verse 31, Solomon tells us, look not on wine when it is red. He says some other things about it. I don't believe the word look there means just don't see it. I am told that the word translated look there is a word that means don't look with favor upon it. Don't look with favor upon alcohol. It didn't say upon a great deal of it, but look not with favor upon it. In Proverbs chapter 31, verses 4 through 6, this is a passage we didn't read last week, but I like to read it today. Proverbs 31, verses 4 through 6. It is not for kings, O Lemuel, it is not for kings to drink wine, nor for princes strong drink, lest they drink and forget the law, and pervert the judgment of any of the afflicted. Give strong drink unto him that is ready to perish, and wine unto those that be of heavy hearts. That's what Solomon is talking about. That's what God feels about it. A person who's going to be in a position of authority making decisions doesn't need to drink it because it will affect his judgment. Now, the difference between a social drinker and a drunk is just a matter of degree, not a matter of kind. Both of them are drunk. The one who takes a social drink is drunk. He's just not as drunk as the one who's drunk driving, or those in Skid Row who are dying. Those who drink alcohol are affected by it. And so the social drinker is just as drunk. I mean, he commits sin as well as those who are sought drunkards. The social drinker is drunk, just not as drunk as those who have much more. Well, there are some who use scriptures in the Bible, and we went over those beginning of last week, and I've shown that the scriptures that are used to justify do not justify. They're efforts for people to justify what they're doing, but it doesn't do it. Social drinking cannot be defended by Scripture, and it cannot be defended by reason. There's just no reason in it. Experts tell us that 99 out of 100 drunkards began as a social drinker. That's right. That's what they say. They've studied it. 99 out of 100 social drunkards began as social drinkers. And so it's a very dangerous thing. And I hope that we will have strength enough to resist the temptation. I would like to give one word of caution to us as the last thing we'll say. If we're not careful, we might have a tendency to close our eyes to the truth of this matter. If we have a son or daughter or some other close relative who is guilty of it, it's easy for us to close our eyes, but we need to keep our eyes open, keep our minds open, do everything we can to keep people from doing that which is wrong. I appreciate your listening. You've listened well, and I appreciate you. Thank you.